Father worked 20 years abroad to provide for his family, came home to find they'd forgotten him completely. Edward Sullivan stood at the doorway of the house he'd been paying for 20 years but had never truly called home. The blue paint was peeling, just like in the photos his wife Margaret used to send, back when she still sent photos. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his worn leather suitcase, the same one he'd carried to Saudi Arabia 2 decades ago when his children were just babies. Now those babies were adults, and he was a stranger. The evening light cast long shadows across the porch as Edward raised his hand to knock. 20 years of 12-hour shifts in the scorching desert heat, 20 years of living in cramped workers' quarters, 20 years of sending every penny home so his family could have a better life. And now, finally, he was home for good. He knocked. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, and a woman in her late 40s stood before him. Margaret, his wife, though she looked nothing like the 30-year-old he'd left behind. Her auburn hair was now streaked with gray, her face lined with years he hadn't witnessed. She stared at him blankly. "Can I help you?" Edward's heart constricted. "Margaret, it's me. Edward, I'm home." Her eyes widened and something flickered across her face. Was it recognition, shock, resentment? "Edward, you're early. I thought you weren't coming until next month." "I wrote to you 3 weeks ago, said I was retiring early. Didn't you get my letter?" Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe. We get a lot of mail. I must have missed it." She didn't move to let him in. "Can I come in?" Edward asked quietly. "It's my house, too." The words seemed to jolt her into action. "Of course." "Yes, come in." She stepped back, but there was no warmth in the gesture. Edward walked into the hallway, taking in everything at once. The walls were covered with family photos. Margaret smiling with the children at graduations, birthdays, holidays. In every single photo, there was an empty space where a father should have been. He wasn't just missing from the photos. It was as if he'd never existed at all. "Margaret, who's at the door?" A young woman's voice called from upstairs. It's your father," Margaret called back, and Edward noticed how she hesitated before saying father, as if testing out an unfamiliar word. A woman in her mid-20s appeared at the top of the stairs. Sarah, his daughter, the baby girl he'd left behind. She was beautiful with Margaret's auburn hair and his own blue eyes. She looked at him with polite confusion, the way you'd look at a distant relative whose name you couldn't quite recall. "Dad?" she said tentatively. "You're home?" "Hello, Sarah," Edward's voice cracked. "Look at you. You're all grown up." Sarah descended the stairs, slowly, as if approaching a stranger in her home, which Edward realized with crushing clarity he was. "Yeah, I'm 25 now. I work at the bank downtown. Got promoted to assistant manager last year." "That's wonderful," Edward said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You were always so smart, even as a little girl." Sarah's polite smile didn't reach her eyes. "I don't really remember being a little girl, at least not with you here." The words hung in the air, like a physical blow. "Where's Daniel?" Edward asked, referring to his son. "Work," Margaret said tersely. "He manages the hardware store on 5th Street. Won't be home until late." Edward nodded, setting his suitcase down. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock he didn't recognize. Everything here had been bought with his money, but nothing belonged to him. He was a ghost in his own home. "I'll make up the guest room," Margaret said, already turning away. "The guest room?" Edward repeated. "Margaret, I'm your husband." She stopped, her back to him. "Edward, you've been gone for 20 years. Our bed, it's mine now. I think we need time to adjust." "Time to adjust," Edward echoed hollowly. "I've sent you money every month for 20 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every emergency. I was there financially even if I couldn't be there physically. Doesn't that count for something?" Margaret turned, and for the first time he saw real emotion in her eyes, but it was anger, not love. "Money? You think money makes up for missing everything? Sarah's first steps? Daniel's first day of school? Every scraped knee, every nightmare, every parent-teacher conference? I raised these children alone, Edward. You were just the bank account that funded our lives." The truth of her words cut deeper than any blade. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I'm going to my room," she mumbled, practically fleeing up the stairs. Edward was left standing in the hallway with his suitcase and his shattered expectations. The next 3 weeks were a special kind of torture. Edward woke each morning in the guest room, a small space that clearly served as Margaret's sewing room, judging by the fabric and patterns everywhere. He'd lie there, listening to his family move through their morning routines he wasn't part of and had no place in. Margaret was civil but distant. She cooked meals, but they ate in near silence. She washed his clothes, but left them folded outside his door rather than putting them away. She existed in the same house but occupied a completely different life. Sarah came and went, offering polite greetings but never staying for conversation. She had a boyfriend, Edward learned, a man named Travis whom she'd been dating for 3 years. 3 years, and Edward had never even known he existed. Daniel, his son, was even worse. The man, Edward had left behind was now 23, tall and strong with Edward's own dark hair and Margaret's stubborn chin. But when he looked at his father, there was nothing but cool indifference. "You're back," was all Daniel had said when they first met, as if Edward had been on a business trip rather than absent for 2 decades. Edward tried. God, how he tried. He asked about their lives, their interests, their dreams. But every question felt like an interrogation, every conversation strained and forced. He'd show up at dinner with stories from Saudi Arabia, the culture, the people, the strange and beautiful things he'd seen. But his family would stare at their plates, offering only monosyllabic responses. One evening, desperate to connect, Edward pulled out a box he'd brought back with him. Inside were gifts he'd collected over the years but never had the chance to send. A delicate gold bracelet for Margaret, a hand-carved wooden jewelry box for Sarah, an ornate dagger for Daniel, the kind Saudi men carried ceremonially. He presented them at dinner, his hands trembling slightly. "I know it doesn't make up for lost time, but I thought of you every day. These are gifts I've been saving." Margaret looked at the bracelet like it was a snake. "Gold? Edward, I can't wear something this expensive. What would people think?" "That your husband loves you?" Edward offered quietly. "That I have a rich husband who is never here," Margaret corrected. "No, thank you." Sarah picked up the jewelry box politely. "It's beautiful, Dad, thank you." But Edward saw her set it aside immediately, and he never saw it again in her room. Daniel didn't even touch the dagger. "I don't want weapons in my house," he said flatly. "It's ceremonial," Edward explained. "A symbol of honor and—" "I know what it is," Daniel interrupted. "I don't want it." The box sat on the table for 3 days before Edward quietly put it away, the gifts untouched. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. Edward woke early, as he always did, and decided to make breakfast for his family, something he'd dreamed about doing for years. He found eggs, bacon, bread, and went to work, humming softly to himself. He was flipping the last pancake when Margaret came downstairs, took one look at the kitchen, and her face went white. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Making breakfast," Edward said, confused by her tone. "I thought we could eat together as a family." "You've made a mess of my kitchen," Margaret's voice rose. "The bacon grease is all over the stove. You've used the wrong pan for the eggs, and you've rearranged all my ingredients." "I was just cooking. This is my kitchen, Edward. I've run this household for 20 years without you. You can't just waltz in and start changing things." The unfairness of it struck Edward like a physical blow. "I'm trying to be part of this family." "You're not part of this family," Margaret screamed, and the words echoed through the house like a gunshot. "You're a stranger who happens to share our last name. You think you can come back after 20 years and we'll just slot you into our lives like you never left? You made your choice when you got on that plane." Sarah and Daniel had appeared on the stairs, drawn by the shouting. "I made that choice for you," Edward shouted back, something breaking inside him. "I went to Saudi Arabia because we were drowning in debt, because you were pregnant with Daniel and we had medical bills we couldn't pay, because the factory closed and there were no jobs here. I left because I loved you too much to watch you suffer." "You left because it was easier than staying," Margaret shot back. "You ran away from the hard part, the daily grind of raising children, of fighting and making up, of being present. You traded being a father for being a paycheck. Someone had to provide. Someone had to parent." Margaret's voice cracked. "Do you know what it's like to be a single mother while technically married? To explain to your children year after year why Daddy can't come home for Christmas, for birthdays, for anything? To watch them stop asking about you because it hurt too much?" Edward looked at his children on the stairs, Sarah was crying silently. Daniel's face was stone. "I sent money," Edward said weakly. "Money doesn't read bedtime stories," Margaret whispered. "Money doesn't teach a boy how to throw a baseball or a girl how to ride a bike. Money doesn't hold you when you're scared or celebrate when you succeed. You sent money, Edward, but you never sent yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. "I see," Edward said finally. He turned off the stove, removed his apron, and walked past his family up the stairs. In the guest room, he repacked his suitcase. His hands were steady, but his vision was blurred with tears he wouldn't let fall. He'd survived 20 years of backbreaking labor in a foreign land, endured loneliness that hollowed him out from the inside, sacrificed every dream and comfort. And for what? To come home to people who'd been better off without him. He was carrying his suitcase down the stairs when Daniel stepped in front of him. "Where are you going?" his son asked. "I don't know," Edward answered honestly. "But I clearly don't belong here." "That's it?" Daniel's voice was sharp. "You're just leaving again?" "What do you want from me?" Edward asked, exhausted. "I'm not wanted here. I thought I was coming home, but this stopped being my home a long time ago." "You're right," Daniel said, and Edward flinched. But then his son's voice softened. "It stopped being your home when you left, but that doesn't mean it can't be again." Edward stared at him. "I don't remember you," Daniel continued. "I was 3 when you left. Every memory I have of having a father is just photos and stories Mom told me. But you know what? You're here now, and that has to count for something. Your mother doesn't want me here." "Mom is angry," Daniel said. "She has every right to be. But Dad," he paused as if testing the word, "anger fades, absence doesn't. If you leave now, you prove her right, that when things get hard, you run." Sarah had come down the stairs, tears still streaming down her face. "I don't remember you either," she said quietly. "But I remember asking Mom every night when you were coming home. I remember making birthday cards for a father who wasn't there to receive them. I remember lying to my friends, saying my dad was on a business trip when he'd been gone for years." She took a shaky breath. "I'm angry too, but I'm also tired of being angry. And maybe I want a chance to know who you are, who we could have been." Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her face was blotchy from crying, her arms wrapped around herself. "Edward," she said, her voice hoarse, "I've hated you for 20 years. Hated you for leaving, hated you for making me do this alone, hated you for making it look so easy to be gone." She wiped her eyes. "But I also loved the man I married, and I don't know if that man still exists." "I don't know either," Edward admitted. "I don't know who I am anymore. I spent 20 years being the foreign worker. I forgot how to be Edward, Sullivan, husband and father." "Then maybe," Margaret said slowly, painfully, "we all need to figure out who we are now. Not who we were 20 years ago, not who we wish we were, but who we are right now, today." Edward set down his suitcase. The months that followed weren't easy. There were more fights, more tears, more painful conversations that left everyone raw and exhausted. Margaret and Edward started counseling, sitting in uncomfortable chairs while a therapist asked questions neither wanted to answer. Edward got a job at the local community center, teaching international relations to high school students. It wasn't much, but it was something. And more importantly, it got him out of the house, gave him purpose beyond just existing in the spaces his family had created without him. Daniel asked Edward to help him build a deck behind the house. They worked side by side in silence at first, but slowly, conversation began. Daniel talked about growing up, about the anger he'd carried, about the man he'd become despite, or perhaps because of, his father's absence. Edward listened, really listened, for the first time in years. Sarah invited Edward to Sunday brunch, just the two of them. It was awkward and stilted, but she told him about her boyfriend Travis, about her dreams of maybe opening her own business someday, about the mother she'd watched struggle and the father she'd imagined. Edward told her about the real Saudi Arabia, not the romantic version, but the loneliness, the homesickness, the nights he'd cried himself to sleep holding a photo of her as a baby. And Margaret was the hardest. They orbited each other cautiously, two people who'd once been intimate now learning each other again. Edward moved into the master bedroom, but they slept on opposite sides of the bed, a canyon of space between them. One night, 6 months after his return, Margaret spoke into the darkness. "I loved you so much when you left," she whispered. "So much that I convinced myself it was noble that I could do this. And then months turned to years, and love turned to resentment, and resentment turned to numbness. I stopped being your wife and became a function, mother, provider, decision-maker. I forgot how to be anything else." Edward reached across the space between them and found her hand. She didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for leaving, for staying away, for thinking money was enough, for not fighting harder to come home sooner." "I'm sorry too," Margaret said, "for shutting you out, for not trying to understand, for making you the villain in our story when you were just trying to survive, same as me." They lay there, hands clasped, while tears soaked their pillows. A year after Edward's return, the family gathered for Daniel's birthday, the first birthday Edward had been present for in 20 years. They sat around a table Edward had helped build, eating food they'd all prepared together. And for the first time since he'd come home, the conversation flowed naturally. Sarah was showing everyone photos of the ring Travis had given her. She was engaged, and she'd asked Edward to walk her down the aisle. Daniel was talking about a promotion at work, and how he'd used some of the money Edward had saved to invest in the business, making him part owner. Margaret was laughing, actually laughing, at a story Edward was telling about a misunderstanding with a Saudi shopkeeper, and the sound was like music. They weren't the family Edward had left behind.